It's a pleasure to welcome the Leader of the NDP into the office. Opportunity to talk about the many things that we have in common in our perspectives, because Canadians expect us, as all parties in the House, to work together to serve them according to their priorities and their desires.
NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh says the Prime Minister has a choice to make, work with the NDP or the Conservatives. That's what it will take, according to Singh, to keep the engine of a Liberal minority running. But what about the Bloc Québécois? They hold more seats than the NDP. Is Singh overestimating his party's relative power, and what will it take for him and his party to support the government's throne speech? And NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh joins us now from our studios in Ottawa. I'm in Toronto here. Hi, Mr. Singh. Great to see you.
Good to see you, Vashi. How's it going?
Good. Thanks a lot for making time for the show today. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
I want to start out by asking you, when you say that you want to see a commitment to pharmacare in the throne speech from the government in order to support that speech, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that you need to see an explicit timeline, for example?
Well, a couple of things. First, it's got to be a commitment to not just pharmacare, not the fill-in-the-gaps model that the Liberals have been floating, but it's got to be what their own report has recommended, which is a universal, publicly delivered single-payer system, so that if a Canadian anywhere in this country needs to have medication, they can use their health card, not their credit card. That's really what I want to see. And by what I mean by concrete steps is not just concrete commitments to the type of pharmacare, universal and public, but also concrete steps that indicate some real movement. So some timelines, a meeting with the health ministers of all the provinces, some clear steps indicating not just nice words, which we've heard from Mr. Trudeau in the past, but some real commitment to action, to actually delivering universal pharmacare to Canadians.
So what's the difference, though, between what the Liberals promised in their platform and what explicitly you expect to hear? I ask because they have said they are committed to that system of pharmacare. However, the money that they allotted in their platform was, I think, just $6 billion over 5 years, no specific timelines there. Do you actually expect in the throne speech to hear, all right, we're going to meet the health ministers in 6 months, we will have this implemented in 5 years? Like, is that the red line for you?
Well, I'm not going to draw any lines in the sand. I'm not really focused on how to tear down government. I actually want to find ways to make government work and how to push the Liberal government and Mr. Trudeau to delivering something for Canadians. So what I'm looking for, first of all, is a public declaration that the pharmacare that the Liberals are going to put in place, first of all, they're going to put it in place, and that it has to be the Hoskins recommended version, which is what all the experts say, public and single payer. To date, the Liberal Party and Mr. Trudeau haven't clearly stated that they want a universal public single payer. They've alluded to a fill-in-the-gaps model, but not a truly public single-payer system. That's something that's important. And I do want to see some concrete steps. So something that indicates that there's going to be some steps taken, a meeting, some timelines. I need something like that. I've also requested that Mr. Trudeau be open to dental care. That's something that during the campaign, many Canadians raised stories about how they couldn't afford to go to a dentist, how it was so costly, and that they would love to be able to see a dentist or get their teeth fixed, but they can't afford it. We proposed a plan to cover 4.3 million Canadians. We want to see an openness for a national dental care program. That's something that I've also asked Mr. Trudeau to indicate some openness to support, as well as some concrete steps for Indigenous justice, meaning dropping the appeal against First Nations kids and really committing to clean drinking water and some strong actions for basic human rights like housing and drinking water.
Did he commit to dropping the appeal?
That's what I asked him to do. He did not close the door on that request, but he did not commit to it. And I'm going to keep on pushing. I think it's the right thing to do. These are kids that deserve equal funding that didn't get it. And as a result, there were some tragic losses, some deaths that could have been avoided, but were partially caused by the lack of funding. And that's something that needs to be remedied. It has to be responded to. These are kids. They should not be being taken to court over the Human Rights Tribunal's decision, which was a very clear and fair decision. I would ask Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal government to drop the appeal immediately. And also, final point that I made really clear is some concrete action on fighting the climate crisis in a way that creates jobs for workers who are worried about their future. We need to be able to respond to the crisis in a concrete, meaningful way, stricter targets, better targets, as well as some accountability mechanisms, but also creating jobs so that people that are worried about the future know that there's going to be investments to create a stable and long-lasting economy.
What specifically do you mean by concrete action? And when you say more aggressive targets, do you mean by 2030? Your party had promised about a 38% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Is that explicitly what you'd like to hear from the Liberals?
What I'd like to see explicitly is a science-based approach. So as the science is developing and we're seeing more evidence come out, we need to be able to respond to the evidence. And I want a science-based approach that helps us prevent what we know could be catastrophic in terms of climate change. We really want to make
How
sure
is that
young
different
people—
than what you've heard from the Liberals so far there? Pardon the interruption, but how is that any different than what I've heard those exact words from the Liberals.
They haven't committed to targets that are in line with what all the science and all the evidence is suggesting. Their targets are essentially the conservative targets, and they have failed to reach them. So they're not anywhere near where we need to be, and that's something that's important. And it's also important that we don't just set a target and then governments miss those targets. There has to be accountability, and so that's something that I'm calling for, which is quite different. The UK government put in place accountability mechanisms that have been very effective in making sure governments actually follow through on targets that they've established. That's something I'd like to see. And that real commitment to not just fighting the climate crisis, but a commitment to investments so that people have good jobs. And that's something that a lot of Canadians are worried about. When they hear climate crisis, they're worried about their future and their jobs. I want people to be confident that we're going to make investments to create good jobs for people, and so that people are not left behind.
I take your point on the accountability mechanism. I just want to be clear on what exactly you're saying where the targets are concerned. Are you insisting that, for example, in the throne speech, the Liberals lay out more aggressive targets and they be in line with the IPCC at about a 38% reduction? Like, is that exactly what you're saying, or are you just saying you want them to say that they'll be more aggressive?
Well, I would love the specificity of being in line with the IPCC. I think that's what we need to do. I'd like to see some clarity around more strict targets that are in line with the IPCC report. That would be something that would give me encouragement that this government is moving in the right direction. But the accountability is just as important, because setting a target without any accountability, again, can be meaningless. And we've seen other governments around the world set targets and miss them. And Mr. Trudeau has done the same thing before. And so we want accountability, and we also want a commitment to creating jobs. These are some of the criteria that are very important, so that I could see a willingness to work together towards making life better for Canadians.
I want to ask you a question that I asked Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet yesterday, and this is in line with some of what you're talking about, where climate is concerned, and a position that you've already taken on the TMX pipeline expansion, that you're against it. I know that there isn't currently legislation in the House on that pipeline expansion, but what I asked Mr. Blanchet, and what I'll ask you is, would you predicate your support for something like the throne speech on blocking that pipeline or seeing the investment that the government has made come to an end? Like, is that part of the calculation for you?
Well, for me, I've been opposed to it, and I will continue to be opposed to it. Where I'm putting my emphasis is, right now we can see some immediate action. I want to see immediate action on ending fossil fuel subsidies. I want to see immediate action on better targets to reduce emissions, and I want to see accountability. Those are things that I'm asking for in the immediate, and I want to see happen. I will continue to oppose the Trans Mountain. That's something that I've made really clear. But in the immediate time, I want to see some clear evidence from Mr. Trudeau that he understands that we need to see some more concrete action on reducing emissions. And there's lots of ways to do that. I want to see some of those concrete measures and some of those signals, so that we know that they're going to take what many Canadians have voted for in this election, many Canadians are worried about. I want to see that the Liberal government and Mr. Trudeau take those very seriously.
So you have no intention of predicating your support on confidence votes on killing TMX?
Well, I'm opposed to it, and I'll continue to be opposed to it. But my focus right now, what I want to see are the things that I've laid out in the short term. And we're going to continue to work on making sure we build a bright future for young people who are worried about the climate crisis. And one of those things that I'm really worried about is that pipeline. But there's many other things that can be done, and I want to see some action right away.
Let me just ask you a general question about the realistic or lack of realistic nature of the kinds of terms that you're trying to set here. Yesterday, the Bloc said that basically that they're open to supporting the throne speech, and then you came out and said that you're open to voting against it. Are you inflating, I guess, your party's actual importance in the sort of structure of Parliament? Do you actually have the leverage that you're trying to say that you do?
Well, I just want to fight for Canadians. And I know that in order to fight for Canadians, to bring in things like pharmacare and national dental care, these are things that we have been fighting for. So if the Liberals have any desire to move ahead with it, they're going to need to work with us to do that. That's something that I believe in. And I also believe that while the Liberals will say nice things, They haven't delivered them in the past, and I don't think they'll deliver it in the future unless they're pushed to do so. And I take that as my role and my responsibility as leader of the New Democratic Party to push the Liberal government and to push Mr. Trudeau to deliver on some real changes that are going to improve people's lives. That's what my role is, and I take that very seriously.
My question is, though, do they really need your support? I mean, they need 13 people to support them no matter what the party. Do they really need the NDP's support to advance the kinds of items on their agenda that you're discussing?
Well, they have a choice. So to be clear, they don't have to work with us. That's right. They could choose to work with the Conservatives and bring in tax cuts for the richest and bring in cuts to services if they want. They could choose to work with a party that's
it's the middle
not
tax
focused
cut,
on
tax cut that they're talking about.
They can work with whoever they want. They can work with any party. And I'm saying that if they want to bring in some real changes that are going to improve people's lives in Quebec and across Canada, New Democrats are committed to that. We're fighting for that. We're not just going to sit back and watch the Liberal government and say we're not going to interfere. We actively want to encourage the government to do better. And so if they want a partner that's going to encourage them to do better, that's us. Again, you're right. Mr. Trudeau doesn't have to work with us, can work with anyone else. That's his choice. That's the Prime Minister's choice, and that's the Liberal government's choice. I would encourage them to respond to the needs of Canadians who've said overwhelmingly that they want a universal pharmacare that's publicly delivered. They need dental care. They want to see some real action on climate crisis. And I'm ready to work towards those things.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you, Vashi. What I want to make really clear is that the Liberal government has to work with parties to pass bills. There's no question about that. Now, if they want to pass something national that benefits all Canadians, they've got really two options for a national party. They can choose to work with the Conservatives. That's a choice that they can make. Or they can work with us. If they want to pass a bill, they need to work with a party. If they want to pass a bill that's progressive, that puts in place something that's national, that's going to benefit all Canadians, they have to work with New Democrats.
NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh had some FaceTime with the Prime Minister this morning. He's the latest opposition leader to speak with Justin Trudeau this week. As you heard there, Singh believes the minority Liberals need the NDP to a certain extent to survive. Is he overestimating, though, his political leverage? Let's see what the Power Panel thinks. In Ottawa tonight, a very big welcome to former Liberal MP for Winnipeg Centre, Robert Falcon-Ouellette, along with the former Director of Policy to Stephen Harper, Rachel Curran, now with Harper and Associates, and the Globe and Mail's Marika Walsh. And expected to join us momentarily in Toronto is Chief of Government Relations for University of Toronto and former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson. We are trying to track him down so that he can join our regular panel. But hello to all three of you. It's wonderful to have you with us. Robert, why don't I start with you? Mr. Singh is talking about the leverage or the power that he believes his party will have in this parliament. Do you think he's overstating it, or do you think he's bang on?
Well, first off, I think the Prime Minister's been doing actually a pretty interesting job after a very hard campaign where there were some difficulties. He's actually looking very conciliatory. He's looking like he's extended a hand of friendship across the aisle, working with premiers and others. And so I think that's looking fairly good and showing a different light to Justin. But at the same time, with this parade of people coming through the office, we are hearing different opinions, and we do see Mr. Scheer as an example, who's fighting for his life, taking a different approach to that. But there is also Mr. Singh, who seems to have some difficulties. Obviously, one, trying to remain relevant, trying to remain in the game, demonstrating that he has something to offer. But there are also multiple options. One is the Conservatives, but there is also the Bloc Québécois, which is also a very progressive voice in Quebec, who is very well defined about what it is they want to advance. But the Bloc Québécois, I actually think, had a really great day yesterday because they actually demonstrated they actually wanted to listen, they wanted to hear what was going to happen, and they were very conciliatory in some of the words they were saying and trying to say, well, how can we actually work together?
I feel like, Rachel, some of our viewers in Western Canada might not agree with the last point there on Mr. Blanchet, but I take your point completely about the type of, Robert, the type of conciliatory tone that Mr. Blanchet took, most especially with Mr. Trudeau. Rachel, what do you think about the NDP's relative power in Parliament structure as it exists right now, and what Mr. Singh said today?
Yeah, I mean, he's not overstating things, I think, in some respects. Now, look, the Trudeau government has a strong minority. No party is going to want to pull the plug on that government right now. And so the Liberals are in a position of power from that perspective. They have got a mandate to govern, and govern at least for a while. Like, there is zero appetite to go back into an election. There's zero appetite to have any of the parties actually overturn the government on a confidence vote, despite their rhetoric at this point. So from that perspective, the Liberals are in a good position. On the other hand, they do need the support of at least one other party to get their initiatives through, to get the speech from the throne through, to get supply bills through. And Jagmeet Singh is not wrong to say that the NDP are the best national option for the Liberals. Trudeau could run into a fair bit of trouble if he relies too heavily on the Bloc Québécois. I can't think of anything that's designed to piss off Alberta and Saskatchewan more than working closely with Mr. Blanchette, especially after his recent remarks about the energy sector. It's also, look, the Bloc is also a regional sovereigntist, separatist party. No national government in Canada is going to want to associate themselves too closely with the Bloc Québécois. So the NDP...
Quickly, sorry, I just interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
The only point I'd make there is that the Bloc is on certain, progressive stances, like Robert mentioned, on climate change, for example.
Sure.
If they wanted to draw on that. Though I imagine, you're right,
Yeah.
they could draw on support from the NDP and the Greens in that instance.
Absolutely. The optics of working with the Bloc Québécois are really problematic if you are a national government in Canada. And I think if the Trudeau Liberals are smart, and I think they are on this issue, they'll want to stay as far away from that association as they possibly can.
Andrew, I think you're with us now. Am I right?
I was so caught up watching.
We are very glad to see you here.
Thank you very
So
much.
we are, of course, talking about Mr. Singh's comments today as he emerged from the meeting with Mr. Trudeau, and especially his characterization of how much or to what extent the Liberals will need the NDP's support. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it was an interesting change of tone coming out of the meeting than what he went into, or certainly what he was positioning yesterday. And again, a change of tone in your interview with him this evening. What we started to see is that he's starting to get the memo that really the NDP is in a pretty precarious position on this. They're not really needed to move forward the government agenda. But on the other hand, he is, I think, picking up this point that Rachel's making, which is he wants to put the Liberals in the spot that they are either forced to govern with the Conservatives, which allows him to claim much more of a progressive mantle around what the NDP stands for, or force them to have to deal with the Separatists, which for all the reasons that have been outlined is a really difficult thing for a party that wants to rebuild its presence in Western Canada. The challenge, though, I think for Singh and the NDP is that they need to make very quickly a decision as to whether they want to be a player in this parliament or whether they want to be the conscience of the parliament. And I don't think that's entirely clear. This sense that he wants to just jam through his platform, which didn't get the support of Canadians during this last election, I think it, for a lot of people, rings as the NDP moving back to kind of where it was 30 years ago as the conscience. It's like these are all great initiatives, but this isn't actually the main agenda in front of the country today. So he's going to have to make a decision about this, and I get the sense they're still really fractured and trying to make up their mind on what to do next year.
That's a really interesting characterization. Marika, I'm wondering what you think, and if you could help us sort of understand some of the objectives that the NDP detailed today, that Mr. Singh detailed today. I found it was difficult to ascertain, for example, like the specifics in the areas that they want to hear about in the throne speech. So they want more aggressive targets on climate change, but it would be nice if they were in line with the IPCC, but they won't say if there's any, they're reluctant to draw any kind of red line. They want talk of pharmacare and a commitment, but do they want money talked about or a timeline? Like there are specific ideas, but the details are not necessarily all there.
That's right, and I think it's because they don't want to be cornered into putting too many demands on the table that they then have to vote against something because, as we've talked about, they do not want to be going to an election. So I think they are trying to walk this line of putting many options on the table so they can, I think in some ways, point to a win no matter what comes out of the throne speech and then be able to vote for it. But also to his positioning today, I think he's trying to delegitimize the idea of working with the Bloc before the Liberals even try to. Because if he's able to put the frame around working with the Bloc, around this idea that they're not a national party, I think that gives him maybe a bit more leverage, or that's the hope it would seem from the party. And I think just putting so many ideas on the table gives them a lot of wiggle room to decide what to actually do with a throne speech when they see it.
Robert, let me circle back to a point that you made right off the top of this segment, and that is the tone that you noticed and the sort of change in tone from the Prime Minister, and I think you characterized it as conciliatory. Do you, how long do you think that will last? And given your experience, you've been in the government benches, sat across the aisle from all of these parties, the fractious relationship between some of the leaders. How genuine, I guess, do you think it is, and how long do you think it might last?
Well, actually, I think it's in the DNA of the Prime Minister. I think he's very conciliatory by nature. He does like to listen. He now allows his MPs to vote against the party on multiple occasions, which is rather unusual in parliamentary history here in Canada. Mr. Scheer, though, obviously for his own reasons, his own survivability, and he's fighting for his life, he needs to take a very hard line on whatever the government does. Mr. Singh as well is going to face that issue as well. Did he perform well enough in the last election, and should he have another crack at during another election? And so he's going to try and look like he's strong and forceful, yet still not precipitate an election. And I think Mr. Blanchet is on the opposite side there a little bit. He's got a little bit more wiggle room, but we can't alienate as well people in Quebec. We can't alienate anyone in the country, and I don't think that really is the Prime Minister's intention. He really does want to extend a hand, try and work with different groups, put forward, obviously in the throne speech, things which are going to be more general in nature, trying to build bridges between different communities, and try and find a way to work forward and actually get things done, which I actually think is actually perhaps the most important consideration, and what Canadians expect from people and what they want to hear from their politicians, not about drawing our little line and this is where we're going to situate ourselves, but actually, how do you actually get something done for people?
Yeah,
I just jump in on this.
Yeah, I want to get actually you and Rachel to respond, because I take the point that that's the message being sent by people, by Canadians. I genuinely wonder how much it permeates the reality that exists on the Hill. And Andrew first, and then a quick comment from Rachel too.
Well, all I was going to say is I think we also have to remember that Justin Trudeau is trying to repair his brand. It is severely damaged and on life support. He has a lot of fence mending to do, I think, with the Liberals themselves. This is a party which is, I think, unimpressed. It went into an election that it should have been able to form actually a large majority and was reduced, humbled and humiliated by the Prime Minister's actions during the campaign that put them into a minority situation. So this is a Prime Minister who is also campaigning to keep his job. And I don't think that we should forget that. I think right now that is what's happening really with all of the leaders, with the exception of Elizabeth May, who's already moved us out of the job. But of all the other major parties, excepting the BQ, their leaders are really auditioning to convince the party faithful that they deserve to still be there. Rachel?
Quick final word to you.
I know Robert said all of that with a straight face, and I do agree with him that is the message that Canadians are sending. They do want leaders to work together and get things done. The problem is, I don't think compromise or negotiation or conciliation is in the Prime Minister's DNA. I think he's going to have a tremendously tough time with that, despite the fact that he's forming government with the lowest percentage of popular vote, I think, in Canadian history. Similarly, Andrew Scheer, as mentioned, is fighting for his political life, is fighting for his leadership, and he's not going to be in a mood to compromise and play nice with the government either. So, yes, I think that's what Canadians want. I'm not sure that's what we'll get.
Opportunity to talk about the many things that we have in common.
We want to make sure that we deliver on real action.
I look forward to discussing those and other issues with Mr. Scheer this morning.
This country is more divided than it ever has been. We need to get to work as quickly as possible.
We'll talk about our shared priorities.
The idea is for some collaboration, as well about some issues which have been raised during the campaign.
Exactly 3 weeks from today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will put his Liberal minority in motion when MPs return to Parliament and his government delivers its throne speech. In preparation, he's met this week with 3 of the 4 opposition leaders. He'll wrap that up tomorrow with the Green Party's parliamentary leader, Elizabeth May. Lots of players in the parliamentary mix. How will they all be positioning themselves? Let's ask 3 people who have experienced minority parliaments firsthand. Joining us from Calgary is Ian Brodie, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Mr. Brodie previously served as Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Here in Toronto, David Hurley is a principal partner at the Gandalf Group. He previously served as Chief Campaign Strategist for the Liberals under Paul Martin. And Bob Gallagher is on the federal executive with the NDP and a former Chief of Staff to NDP Leader Jack Layton. Hi to all three of you. Great to see you.
Hello.
Thanks for having us. Good to see you, Vassie.
Thanks so much for making time for us. I really appreciate it. Mr. Hurley, I'm going to start with you, and I want to talk about these meetings that we've been witnessing, these glorious photo ops from all week. Is this about something tangible actually happening? Is this just entertaining the opposition leaders? What's at work here?
I think it's very preliminary. I think it's very get to know you. Probably some soft talk with Singh and Blanchette about where there might be common ground to work. I doubt very much that there was anything very specific being discussed, just the beginnings of a working relationship. And with Mr. Scheer, it was just optics. That meeting had to happen, but everybody knew nothing was going to come of it. So,
Mr. Brody, is that a fair assessment?
I think that's mostly fair, but look, the Liberals will be feeling out the opposition parties to see what it is that they're going to have to put in the window in order to give them cover to vote to keep the government in office, or at least to neutralize them on the key confidence motions. And that's, I think Mr. Trudeau must have been in listening mode rather than in talking mode in these meetings.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and one I was wondering how much of this, Mr. Gallagher, is about sort of figuring out, especially for the government, how to position itself as you head into the throne speech, as you head into Parliament convening and all that is to come after that. How much figuring out are they doing in these meetings?
Yeah, they're doing quite a bit of figuring out in terms of the personalities and where they want to go. But the rubber won't hit the road on the throne speech. It's really the budget that where they're going to really have to figure out who they can dance with and who's willing to dance on what issues.
Mr. Hurley, do you think that's true? Is it the budget the big event here, or?
Actually, I think that Ian's being a bit modest, because I think that the Martin and the Harper governments taught us what matters in a minority parliament. And that is that if you're the government and you would win an election if it were called, the opposition parties will support you whether they like what you're doing or not. And if you look like you would be defeated if an election were called, the opposition will defeat you whether they support what you're doing or not. A la Mr. Layton and the NDP defeating the Martin government on its budget, childcare, etc. They saw an electoral opportunity there. The Liberals supported the Harper government for years because they were afraid to meet them electorally. That's what matters in this context. The permanent campaign is on.
Mr. Brody, is that... Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Gallagher, then I want to get Mr. Brody in too.
But David, what you forget is the time before bringing down the Liberal government, which was propping up the Liberal government by bringing in the budget that changed the budget quite dramatically.
Absolutely. And that was a collaborative process.
So the outside scenario in terms of the popularity of the government and the ability, whether there's scandals or corruption or components that could actually bring down the favorability of the government, that is the mix upon which you actually build either a consensus, like Jack Layton did initially, right, or you bring down a government, like we brought down the Liberals at the end when the corruption was just out of hand.
Mr. Brody, is it ultimately all about an electoral calculation?
It is about the electoral calculation is the big calculation here. Nobody wants to go back to an election until they're ready to fight an election and have a good chance of thinking they're going to win it. But let me go back to David's point about this. One of the lessons we learned, I think, from watching the Martin government, I was chief of staff both during our time in opposition in a minority and our time in government in a minority. When Mr. Harper became Prime Minister, at every budget, he was careful to put one thing in the budget, a piece of what that could be appealed, could be an appeal to each of the opposition parties. And my job on budget day was to phone Bob in some cases, my counterparts in the other parties, to point out, your piece is on budget page number 247. If you're going to vote for us, great. Here's something you can hang your hat on. If you're not, well, we'll see you at the polls. We were in a strong position whenever I was chief of staff, so we never had to worry in the end about being defeated. But we were sure to give face-saving opportunity to each of the opposition leaders if they wanted to take advantage of it. And I think that would be a lesson Mr. Trudeau would be wise to learn.
It's not going to be difficult, though, because at least with the NDP, there's so much commonality of objective between the two platforms. There are differences in mechanics of how to deliver those things, but I can't imagine that the Liberals and the NDP won't be able to find a lot of common ground for a while.
Do you think that's true, Mr. Gallagher?
Well, I think the NDP, in addition to trying to get something done on the priorities that Jagmeet has set out, they also have to worry about differentiating themselves from the Liberals. And so they can't just come on to a Liberal a program that people will simply recognize as a Liberal program. They need to be able to extract, and to do that, they need to be clear about what it is in each of these policy areas is actually an NDP component, and that's where the real problem is going to come in terms of the budget.
Mr. Brody, what about the Conservatives? Mr. Hurley earlier in, and I'm paraphrasing, but said something to the effect of there isn't really a lot of common ground between the Conservatives and the Liberals. What's your assessment of, and not so much what's obvious on the front end of it, but what you think the calculation is behind the scenes for the Conservatives as they decide how to progress through this Parliament?
The Conservatives have lots of room here to oppose the government. They're free to oppose the government, I think, because of this dynamic that David and Bob have been talking about, the alignment between the NDP and the governing Liberals. But let's not make too much of this, Vashi. The math is such, the Liberals will continue on in office if they can get just one of the opposition parties to abstain. They don't need active support from any of the opposition parties. They just need to neutralize the NDP. That limits the NDP's ability to extract concessions here from them. They can give a half a loaf instead of a full loaf. And frankly, none of the parties will have money to go back to an election until April when the election rebates are paid. For the case of the NDP, it could be well beyond that if I read the balance sheets from the public filings properly. So in this dance between the Liberals and the NDP, I think the Liberals have the upper hand. The NDP's in financial trouble, and that gives the Conservatives the freedom to be the ones that are actually the opposition of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Hurley, do you agree?
I do agree. I think that the NDP will not be looking for an election quickly. They need to sort out both their financial situation, but also maybe sort out how they could do better in the next election. I don't know that there's an obvious strategy for that, so they'll probably need to do some thinking about that. And I think the Conservatives are in a much better position that way than the Liberals were when Mr. Harper took office, because the Liberals didn't feel like they could be the full opposition to the Harper government because that would provoke an election, and which they would do worse in. And so they actually played a very weak hand, probably badly, for quite a long time. Scheer will have the full latitude to oppose this government. Whether he's going to oppose it in a way that it actually advances Conservative interests or advances his own leadership interests is a different question.
Well, if we're talking here about a coalition of interest between the Liberals and the NDP, fundamentally, that pulls the Liberals to the left end of the political spectrum. I'm not too worried for Mr. Scheer. He'll have lots of opportunity to move across the right end of the political spectrum and into the center in that circumstance.
Mr. Gallagher, let me ask, and I'll ask the same question of all three of you, drawing on your experience in minority situations. If there's one piece of advice that you have, and I'll ask you for the NDP, in this Parliament, what would it be?
Well, this is a pretty stable minority government, and it's going to go on for quite a while. And so I would say be patient. I would dare say that Jagmeet Singh has done a good job of letting it be known that he doesn't necessarily have to support. There are other folks who the Prime Minister can go to, and that you be patient, and while you're being patient is define your brand. Let folks know what your priorities are. Let them know whose side you're on, and that's going to do you well when the opportunity comes to maybe 3-4 years down the road when the government is not as popular, and in fact at that point you might get something the way Jack Layton did in 2005.
Mr. Brody, same thing, drawing on your experience, your one piece of advice.
My advice to the Prime Minister is to be careful about the corruption issues, on fiscal issues, on government programs, on the direction of the economy. It'll be hard for Scheer, Singh, and Mr. Blanchet to come together to defeat the Liberals on any of those sort of normal political issues. But on corruption issues, if there's another whiff of an SNC type problem like that, that's the sort of cross-cutting issue where the opposition parties could easily form a coalition and force him back to the polls earlier than he expects.
Mr. Hurley, based on your experience, the biggest piece of advice you'd offer?
The Liberals need to figure out a way to turn this minority back into a majority. And that, in my view, means really getting back to focusing hard on middle class and working class economics, which I think they deviated from in the latter part of their mandate. And that's what they really need to, I think, secure more seats. And that's where I think they should go policy-wise.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I want to thank all three of you very much for sharing your time with us this evening. I really appreciate the time and the insights. Thank you.
Happy to talk,
Thank you.
Thanks to Ian Brody, David Hurley, and Bob Gallagher. Hi, Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.